Hello and welcome to another webinar in our Broadband Bunch Zero Touch Learning Series. I'm your host, Joe Coldabella. Before I turn the discussion over to our moderator, Guy Vivente, I want to thank our sponsors: ETI Software Solutions, Broadband Simplified; Utopia Fiber, building a more connected Utah; DXTEL, marketing for today's fiber providers; and Calix, simplify, excite, grow. If you're into all things broadband, check out our website, broadbandbunch.com. Also, follow us on our social media channels so you never miss an upcoming event. We're on LinkedIn, just type in Broadband Bunch in the search bar. And we're also on Twitter @PodcastBunch. This webinar is on demand, so there will be no audience participation. Our topic: are providers seeing a return on next-gen technologies? Guy, take it away.
Well, thank you, Joe, and thank you to our panelists as well. I'd like to also thank those listening in to this session today, as Joe mentioned, focused on telecom investments in next-gen technology. So I think where I'd like to start is really with some data that I found that came out from Gartner earlier this year, where they projected that worldwide IT spending would increase by 5%, reaching $4.5 trillion. And really they made an additional point that companies would be moving out of a more post-pandemic reactive response with IT to more of a long-term focus, which takes into account adopting some more strategic initiatives that do include next-gen technologies. Thinking about telecommunications, our industry, and if you look at all tiers, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 players, I think we would all agree they've been very active in automation and adopting next-gen solution for modernization projects, competitive response, and so on. It is true that, as we approach the end of 2022, we have actually seen some telcos pull back a little bit. I think that's driven mostly by some of the macroeconomic dynamics that we're all aware of. But I anticipate that telecoms at all tiers will again engage and be very active in 2023. So without a doubt, technology and specifically next-gen solutions are at the forefront of telecoms, and I think they will be. The question that we're going to explore today includes, are telecoms seeing a return on those investments? We'll just have a healthy dialogue about that very question, right? And by the way, to actually narrow the discussion, we're going to focus on a few specific next-gen, or what most people think as more evolutionary technologies, and those will include artificial intelligence, software productivity, ERP, autonomic systems, and we'll wrap up with some discussions on blockchain. So that kind of sets the framework of today's dialogue. And with me today are two industry veterans, Sai Dubagunta. Sai, welcome. Sai is a principal at HCL, and Sai has led many transformational efforts in telecom that include digital transformation, modernization, very involved in the next generation of wireless. And in addition, we also have Tom Taylor. Welcome, Tom. Tom is a strategy lead at ETI Software Solutions, and Tom is a thought leader. He doesn't describe himself as that, but I'll call him that. He's a thought leader in the new technology space and the evolutions that take place in telecom. So with that, gentlemen, you ready to get started?
Ready. Absolutely, Guy.
All right.
Thanks for having us.
Oh, sure, my pleasure. Let's start with artificial intelligence. Clearly, most business leaders see AI as a driver to innovation. In fact, most will tell you that it's one of the leading next-gen solutions that brings real evolutionary change. Telecoms have been exploring AI and looking at how they can deploy AI at scale, okay? In fact, some will say that it's moved from the experimental stage, right? Let's kick the tires on it, to more of a real resource, a resource in the IT tool bag. So, Sai, I'd like to start there and hear your thoughts on, are you seeing the shift from more experimental to actual adoption?
It's a good question, Guy. Based on my experience, I'm seeing it being adopted in pockets, right? It depends on two things. One, do you have enough data which is quality coming into you, right? So that you can do the learning and intelligence on that. And second is what places it makes sense within the organization. Some aspects is very clear. If you are looking at online purchasing of customers, it's very easy to understand. But telcos are really huge companies, right? When you say AI and the use of AI for increased productivity of telco as a whole, it covers a lot of territory. And even though we have it in pockets, I think what's missing is the threading of it all, right? People refer to it with different names. Digital threads, for example, you have so many processes. How do you get them connected together so that you have quality data coming in and you can take some inferences on that, right? So there's a lot of thought going on here. And like I said earlier, there are some things being implemented, whichever are in the traditional sense called low-hanging fruit, if I may. But I see some movement to actually take advantage of it. Digital twins is where there's a lot of conversation these days, both on order to cash. For example, if you order a new cell phone, there's a lot of process before you have a new plan. You can probably get the plan set up in like 30 minutes, but finally the phone has to arrive at your home and you activate it, and there's a lot of things that go on, and there are a lot of challenges in every step of this area, and getting it all together is one area where you can use a lot of AI. Self-care is another one, right? Support is especially in terms of your standard wireline and business services. And networks, of course, you have huge networks supporting. How do you get AI, ML, digital twins to support you on the network? There's a lot of thought going into these areas. To answer your question, maybe, in the next 2-3 years, there will be a lot of energy going into this. This is the unexplored frontier, if you will, to a large extent.
Yeah, I agree with those comments. Maybe a quick follow-up for you, Sai. People talk about deploying AI at scale. Maybe just one or two comments on what's needed to deploy AI at scale. What should we be thinking about?
So there are two things. One is the technology aspect, which is the tools and the people who can code to the tools and all that, which I think you have today, right? The business goals of that, right? In some areas you have clarity, in some you don't. So unless you have clear business goals on what you want to accomplish with this AI, you cannot really scale, right? So that's the thing where there is progress being made. Like I said earlier, probably in the next 2-3 years, we'll see a lot of that happen.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Again, nothing new, right? In most major efforts, you really need a good vision and some established goals. I don't know if you guys have heard of, I just love how these new little titles and tags come along. One of them was AI bias, and I looked at AI bias. Past the tagline, AI bias makes sense. We all know that AI depends heavily on data, right? To build your machine learning models, okay? And a study, this one specifically that I'm quoting was done by Data Robot, actually discovered some bias, basically saying you have bias in your data that, if you're not focused, can actually lead to some unexpected and negative, I would say, consequences. In fact, some of the data from that study said that they looked at like 350 US companies, and 1/3 that actually deployed AI, 1/3 had some negative results that they attributed to AI bias. In fact, a big percentage, like 60%, said that they even experienced some customer and revenue loss, and 40% even attributed it to staff attrition. And you know, Tom, as I think about those numbers, and I think, okay, let's say they're off even by 50%. Okay, you know how the statistics go, right? There's some concerning statistics there. So if you're a telecom executive and you're looking to adopt and actually share some expectations as Cy laid out, should they move or should they be worried about that data?
So, Guy, first off, I find that data to be wildly surprising. I mean, that's hard to believe that, smart guys are implementing new technology and it's not, moving things in the right direction. So I like what Cy said, is that a smart thing to do is to do it in a pocket, right? In a pocket that makes sense for your business and how that technology fits together. And you would think that if you're pretty careful about where you use it, you can potentially, not fall into one of these pitfalls where things are going in the wrong direction. And I think one of the things that we kind of forget is that in ML, machine learning, we put most of the emphasis on the machine. We really should put the emphasis on the learning. And it could be that when you first roll out, there is a bias, right? But the whole point is for the system to learn. And like Cy said, it learns as it gets more and more data, good data. And what's going to counter these negative responses is humans doing their jobs. And that's what we do as humans, is we can check this stuff. So imagine, Guy, I convince you to buy a new system and you roll it out. You're going to say, hey, Tom, you need to be checking this along the way so that we can see that we're actually getting the results that you can get. So I would say a ML system that you roll out that kind of left alone is unchecked is not a very good idea. But if you say, hey, should we roll this out? Be worried about the statistics? I say, absolutely. Let's focus on rolling out where it makes sense. Let's focus on learning, and let's focus on tracking the business responses as we move forward. Make sense?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I like that emphasis on the learning part, not the machine part. I like that a lot. In fact, it brings out another discipline, I'll call it, in AI, where people talk about MLOps, right? We talked about DevOps, DevSecOps, MLOps, which really, when you pull back the tagline, focuses on some of what you, Tom, and Cy brought out, which is adopting some best practices, right? Learn along the way, but bring some formality to it, right? In a way where these best practices remove some of that data bias. Okay, great. I appreciate that feedback, guys. I'd like to shift now to software productivity, right? And I'm going to narrow it down specifically on development tools, right? A big part of our audience usually comes from the engineering side. And, when I was at AT&T or even at companies prior to AT&T, we were always on this constant quest for how do we improve productivity, right? Which usually means how do we speed up development and how do we get to market a little bit faster? And we explored and adopted software productivity tools like many companies have done. Today's tools, in this space really leverage, the more modern tools leverage AI, what we just talked about. In fact, I've been following a little bit Microsoft GitHub tool called Copilot, which is considered a pair programming tool, which, or said another way, a tool to help developers writing code. In fact, write some of the code for them or make suggestions on code. When I first started reading about it, late spring, early summer, they had already added 400,000 subscribers, Microsoft. And by the way, they were all in the what I'll call the pilot stage, but that's a lot for piloting, right? And just recently, they at least made some announcements that they're getting ready to roll it out for business consumption. So again, if you think about it as a tool that suggests code, right, and functions for developers, some of the use cases that they saw in the pilots is that the tool in some cases generated 35% or more of the code for the actual developers. By the way, they're not the only game in town. Amazon has one called Code Whisper, and then there are other vendors that have competing tools. So I'm going to come back to you, and I'm thinking about a discussion we hosted in a prior webinar that focused on what's going on with skills and talent, right? The war on talent and technology, the great resignation. We've seen, again, many discussions on that. And when I think about this tool, right, and the fact that there is a war on talent, I thought, boy, this may be a great answer, right? Make us more productive, actually generate some code. So I'd like to come to you and ask what your thoughts are on such a tool, and if you've seen some adoption in the telecom space.
Absolutely, Guy. That's a very loaded question. You could probably talk about it for hours together. But
Okay, see if we can do it in 5 minutes, maybe.
I'll try to keep it short. This whole tools generating code is not a new thing. You could lay the argument back to the days of compilers, because you didn't have to write assembly. A tool generated assembly for you, right? And then you have all these middlewares like Corba and whatnot, which allowed you to generate some code. So there's always, the need to reduce the complexity of coding was an effort by what you call smart people for a long time, right? And I'm sure in our own days we did some code generators ourselves, right, to help us. So that's always been in play. But if you look at things, if you compare it back to when you and I started, and maybe even Tom, long time ago, that we used to do a lot of coding ourselves. I remember coding linked lists and maps and a lot of protocol stuff. We don't do that anymore. There are packages that do all of that. It has been simplified. Most of the work we do these days, or developers do these days, is around meeting the business goals of these enterprises, right? Whether it's telco or somebody else. And most of the time they spent is also in understanding the business requirements, making sure they achieve the objectives. That's where most of the effort goes, right? And that part will probably always remain to a large extent human in nature, if you will, that understanding that this is the goal of my writing code, right? But if you go back to your question, the basic, the fundamental premise of that question is that either developers don't know how to code, or they are slow in how to code, or they are making a lot of mistakes in coding, or they are not able to test it. These are some aspects I think can be improved by some of these tools you're talking about, right? But just the tool is not enough. I think companies should adopt their own philosophies or platforms, if I can use the word generically, because what happens these days is, it's all open source days. People can go and pull whatever they want and start coding around it, right? There is no standardization and there is no expertise built within the company. That's where you have a lot of mistakes coming in and so on. So if you decide on a platform that this is a set of tools, there's a set of packages, this is a set of middleware, this is what I will use within my company, then you can layer some automation tools like you said, right? I don't know if you can ever approach a zero code for telcos, right? Or even minimal code like 10%, but like you said, the 30 to 50% can be achieved if you have a nice platform and layer some tools on it. which will help in sort of constructing your designs, giving you templates of what you should code, and allow you to test it, right? So I think that's where we should go, platform and some customizations of tools to help, telcos in particular, but it's a common question across a lot of industries.
Yeah. No, you're so right. And you mentioned assembly code, assembler, one of the first programming languages. In my undergrad, I swore I would never take a job coding an assembler. Was going to be the end of it. But my first job was an assembler. But it really did take you down to the machine level. So I appreciate what you said there. You also brought up another point, and that is that some of these tools, again, just like we made a comment earlier, some of these concepts are not new. I actually recall, transitioning, after the assembly days to actually working on some mid-range computing that included some code generators. And maybe they were fairly sophisticated, I think, for its time. So I don't think it's new, but I don't know, Tom, call me cynical, because I still have some scar tissue from those code generators. We had issues with scalability, issues with performance, and I saw another research paper that came out of some of the universities that started piloting at least one of those tools that I mentioned. I won't say which one, and they saw security vulnerabilities in about 40% of the code. Okay, again, even if it's off by 50%, I think that would concern me. So I'm interested in your thoughts about jumping in and adopting some of these software productivity tools.
Yeah, like you said, I also did assembly in one of my first jobs, and we did that because hardware was hard. It was hard to get, and code efficiency was a big deal. And now, as I pointed out, with these platforms and code generators, that's not so about efficiency. It's just putting it together faster and that kind of thing, right? And I like what you focused on about the security issue, because I think that's one of the things that we overlook a lot. With a lot of these code generators or no code, low code kind of things, it's all about putting the system together quickly. Machines helped us do that, but we didn't really look at how did the machines do it, and are there any issues like security vulnerability issues? Because machines are great, they're fast and repeatable, but because it's machine generated, it's also easy for another machine to find the loopholes in it. And I think you'll hear this as a common theme with me, is that you can't rely just on the machines. Again, we need the human element, because what are we as humans good at? We're incredibly imaginative and messy code writers and things like that. And that's important to look at some of the code specifically for security vulnerabilities. And until we put the machine and human pieces together, we're going to have some security issues, right? But when we, as humans, put our imaginative, messy minds around this code that's been written and look at it from a slightly different way, we may find some vulnerabilities that came to us through the kind of the code generating world. So I'd be a big believer in you want to have humans looking over some of the code you've written, and I would start specifically with security issues.
Right. And of course, you can always scan that code that's generated, right, with all the tools that are available in the marketplace to see if some of those security vulnerabilities have been created. So I'm hearing, again, don't be too shy, but of course, be very disciplined in adoption. Some great insights and some common threads in both the artificial intelligence, AI side, and the software productivity, the focus on software productivity tools that we just discussed. Let's pivot again. Let's talk about cloud a little bit. In fact, Sam, I'm going to come to you here in a minute, but you and I have both done some work in the cloud space in recent years, right? And specifically, I would say, because cloud is a big space, I'm talking about infrastructure as a service, IaaS. So IaaS, and really the cost savings tied to IaaS. And in telecom, we have seen cloud being made a priority in the last few years. In fact, one study that I thought was interesting looked at cloud infrastructure spend compared to in-house think data center infrastructure spend, and they saw cloud infrastructure spend year over year go up about 35%, while inside or hardware and software in-house data centers going down, but it was only 6%. Now again, they're only percentages. Maybe the numbers show that there's a trade-off. But some articles, in my experience in telecom, show that there was definitely a slowdown, some slowdown in movement towards cloud towards the end of 2022. Some say it's going to pick back up. I'm not so sure to the same degree. So, Sai, I think that the industry is definitely seeing cloud as part of their infrastructure solution set, an option, but not necessarily a foregone conclusion. Okay, so I'm interested in your thoughts on that. What are you saying?
This is another 5-day question, Guy, which I have to finish in 5 minutes. But
maybe we can do a bunch of follow-ups.
So, I mean, there are many different angles you can look at it, but let's just take a telco for now, right? If you look at a telco, you have two kinds of workloads at a very broad level. You have the network workloads and IT workloads. The network is a different game. So let me focus for now in my answer on the IT workloads, right, where you have applications. It's sort of simpler to understand one way. And even here, if you look at the main drivers in the last 5-6 years, for example, why people wanted to move to cloud, what you said is right. This whole capex opex thing, that you reduce the amount of money you spend, because there is always a refresh. If I have an application running, there are general metrics available that 1/3 of my servers I refresh every year for many reasons, right? There's a lot of cost that goes in year after year, and there's a lot of operations and time we spend. If somebody comes and tells me, hey, you don't have to go through all of that, I'll just give it to you in the cloud. You don't know where it is and what. You just ask me what you want, I'll give that to you. And also, you don't have to pay me one shot, you pay me monthly or whatever, you negotiate. It's a very interesting model, to subscribe to. Say, hey, I want to do it, right? Two things are appealing. One is the cost, and one is you can give me what I want when I want. Even in your IS, your restricted discussion now, right? So a lot of people went towards the direction, but there is a beyond subscribing to that philosophy and getting the resources you want. There's a bigger aspect to moving to cloud, which is your whole application. That goes back to probably your previous question on how things were built over the years and how much process and legacy you have. Do you have the ability to move all of that into cloud? You have to look into all these things. And that is where I think, if you look at your 35% was 6%, like you said, even though, one may have taken the decision to jump to cloud and do some, going back to your first question, experimentation there, for example, for some time, it is not easy to migrate 100% of what you have there, right? So you are not reducing your refresh of what you have on-prem, right? So that's why you see increase in cost a little bit, right? Because you added on to your 100%, you added on another, using your numbers, another 30% to it, right? That's a feeling, in general around the industry. It's not limited to telcos, right? Where the push was there to go and explore this frontier. There are some applications for which it makes sense, but you are not able to entirely move everything. You cannot close shop on-prem and move there. Half of it sitting here, half there. You ran into this hybrid. Hybrid actually increased your cost because of egress. A lot of different parameters came in. Not all companies have the same issues, right? So if you look fast forward, right, especially a telco. See, telco has assets on-prem, and telco has these data centers, which you modernize a bit, it becomes telco cloud for that matter, and you have the public cloud. I think if you fast forward 10 years, you will see, mission critical things running in all the three areas, right? Maybe the on-prem, which is not part of telco cloud, may start to shrink a bit, right? Your telco cloud may expand. there will be edge, especially with all the new applications for, downtime minimization and so on. You may have things running on your data centers or networks where you are running mission critical applications. So there will be a new way of looking at things, if I can say that in few years from now. Cloud will still be there, it won't go away because it makes sense for a lot of applications, but you have to evaluate it correctly on if you want to move everything to cloud or it's hybrid. What is the hybrid definition of hybrid, the architecture? It takes some time to get to a, into a point where you're cruising along.
Yeah, no, those are good points. I'm going to push on it a little bit though, because I agree with everything you said, from the point on OpEx, EPEX, to you use different words, but the elasticity that comes with a cloud environment and the ability to not get back into a technical debt situation. I agree with all in. I was all in. And then I read reports on, like, what Dropbox did. Dropbox, a lot of people are familiar with Dropbox. They actually reported, and by the way, this is not just I read somewhere, they have it in their S1 data, that they saved $75 million by repatriating workloads, basically getting them off the cloud and bringing them back in-house. I think about a company like that because what do we know about startups? Nowadays, if you and I were about to start up a new company, we likely would use a cloud environment that's cheaper, it's faster, right? But that such large companies have actually made a decision to pivot and actually reporting some huge cost savings, like the one I reported. There's others out there. I often wonder, and Tom, I'm going to come to you, just pushing a little bit on that. With all the benefits, did the cloud providers oversell this, and did some companies leap prematurely?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I like your statistics about what Dropbox is doing, because I think, to be fair, the way the cloud was sold in the beginning, and Cy touched on this some, is it's to be like a startup, to do things better, faster, right? To have a skunkworks team on the side to go try things. It was all pushed to cloud. And unfortunately, what a lot of big companies heard was, hey, if we want to be more like a startup, we need to go to the, more and more into the cloud. And of course, the cloud providers like that story, and they kind of sold it. And I think we all agree that the cloud is wonderful for small startup companies, right? The startups I've been at, we were all cloud because it was the only way that you could get going fast and use all of the platform capabilities that the cloud offers. And the cloud by itself is also a great solution for some mid-sized companies, right? Because they don't have the technical chops to do it all inside. And so it's great to push it off to the cloud. Like Cy pointed out, and your statistics point out, as we get bigger as a company, then we need to think about this, because the more you use the cloud, the more it costs. And the cost trade-off benefit needs to be carefully studied. And as we talked about, it's partly a manpower issue too, right? Even though I'm spending a lot of money in the cloud, do I have within my workforce the capability I need to pull some things back in, put some things back on-prem? Do I need to hire some folks to do that? And I need to think about, like Cy said, where 3-5 years from now, where do I want to be? And maybe I want to go and invest on some folks, some I don't have, to pull some of the technical capabilities back inside to reduce those cloud expenses. So I think we're going to see more and more big companies doing some trades where they'll have some of, to use Cy's words, some of their IT applications in the cloud, no question, it's the perfect place for it. And some other things they're going to bring inside on-prem, and it'll largely be driven by the balance of dollars and technical capability to support my, let's say, on-prem solutions. That make sense?
Oh yeah,
If I can add a couple of more points, Guy, on this topic, right? Two things you have to look at. One is the architecture, and the second important point is governance. I don't know the exact architecture of the example you cited, but what I see many times, the prevailing model of cloud migration is lift and shift. If you have something running on 10 servers on-prem, you go to cloud and use the same 10 servers, whether you need or not, right? Then your costs are going to go up. Okay, so you have to make a change in your architecture, saying I had 10 sitting at home, so I was using all of them, right? But I don't really need 10. I probably need only 6, right? That kind of architectural change is needed. Otherwise, like you said, the cost will go up. I've seen that in some places. In fact, you and I discussed this a lot of times, right? The second is governance. If I make a decision as a architect or a developer to use certain features in the cloud or a certain number of machines, who is governing it to make sure that I made the right decision? Yeah, things are running on the cloud. Okay, I proved that. But whether I made the right decision to actually do it the way I did, that governance is needed.
Yeah. In fact, I wasn't going to take us down this path, but you bring up an interesting point. What I've seen, Sai and Tom, is that up front, maybe where the governance begins, to your point, Sai, the quantification of how many applications fall under lift and shift is usually exaggerated, meaning there's a big number, a high percentage. And unfortunately, there more modernization or some change needed to take place, which all of a sudden makes, a 60-day effort. Unfortunately, I've seen up to 6 months, right? Depending on the level of re-architecture needed. But it doesn't, change the fact that some of these data points, of cloud infrastructure and the impact on margins. I mean, some of these come from some well-known companies, right? I mentioned one, but you look at Adobe, DocuSign, Slack, Zoom, and some of the studies, when they look at these large companies, not only those that I mentioned, but I wanted to throw in some that people are very familiar with, they're saying that it's eating away at about $100 billion in market value. That is just astronomical, right? Putting a real pressure on margins. So you guys brought up some key points, so maybe I'll kind of summarize in short here, and then we'll move on to another space. But I think what you're both saying is that with that governance thought in mind, you really need to understand really your environment better. And we will likely see, okay, we're already starting to see that shift, that we're going to have hybrid environments, cloud and data center. And the thing that I don't think's come up yet in your comments that I would add is the part that's cloud, we're going to start seeing multi-cloud providers, right? I think we're seeing some companies that are going all in with one partner or another, but I think it's going to be hybrid, the way you both shared, and I would add multi-cloud.
Multi-cloud. I think that's actually decided by your application partners too. For example, if you use company A to provide your CRM and company B to provide your ERP, they may be using different platforms. So you need to have.
Good. All right, good thoughts. Let's talk about ERP or even ERM, enterprise resource planning. Again, another large space, and yes, Si, we can talk for an hour or two on this one too, maybe a day. But a couple of points just to kind of narrow some thoughts. In telcos, like other industries, we've seen ERP implementations, or at least the adoption of ERP, and they're at the top of the list in terms of priority. And again, I think it's very closely tied to this concept of let's automate everything. Maybe we move from, you guys talked about zero code or no code, but that concept comes into play there. We moved from coding to configuration, right? And now again, I want to bring in a dose of some realities, right? So I believe that those solutions have a point, but when I look at some articles on failed deployments of ERP solutions, I'm telling you guys, not to go back in history again, but it's reminding me of the days of when all the CRM players were out there, right? The statistics are mind-boggling. I'll use one outside of our industry. J&J Snack Foods estimated $20 million in revenue loss that they could directly tie to a botched up transition to an ERP system. I know the one, but I'm not going to name that one. And Dive Brief said that $7.6 million, same company, rise in operational costs. So I think about that. I'm thinking, wait a minute. Regardless of all the labels put on why people do this, I keep saying, you know, my opinion, cost reduction has generally been one of the key drivers. And then I overlay that with a McKinsey study that said that 75%, yes, repeating it is worth it there, 75% of ERP implementations are over budget and over schedule. And I know, by the way, they threw in 2/3 never hit the ROI. In fact, have a negative ROI. 2/3? Come on, guys, that is mind-boggling. Again, some of those data points are not that different than what we saw in the past, and I think of CRM, you know, in its heyday. So, Sai, I don't know, those are lackluster numbers, right? The performance doesn't scream. So I'm interested thinking about ERP, the ERP space, CRM space, and those statistics. What are your thoughts about this space and some insights for the audience here?
I think this ERPs and CRM, right? These are huge systems in one sense because they have a lot of process that is built into it, right? It's not just code, okay, or tool. There's a lot of process, and people make decisions over time to configure it a certain way, or they made some rules within the company. All this is, you know, hidden into their existing implementations. When you quote some numbers like, you know, they went over budget or whatever, many times I've seen the reason is you don't have knowledge of what was done in the last 20 years, for example, right? So if somebody came to me and posed this problem, my first suggestion would be go and see if you can reduce the cost, right? Negotiate a better deal with right? Unless you are into digital transformation and you think your current system does not lend itself well to your new vision of the company, right? That's a totally different game. Now, when you go to digital transformation, here some people make a mistake again. There's a difference between innovation and transformation, right? You know, we keep discussing this all the time. Digital innovation can be done in pieces, like I can add something on top of what exists or to the side of it and get something going together quickly, right? I do some new thing, that's why it's called innovation, right? Whereas, you know, when you do something with a CRM or ERP, right, you're not necessarily innovating those systems, you're trying to transform them to give you better visibility, better data, better APIs, better interfaces. Transformation is not a quick thing. You have to think seriously about it, right? Because what exists today has a lot of intangible, if I can use the word, the decisions people made over time. They wrote somewhere and forgot. You know, there's a lot of things that need to come in. You need to carefully, you know, make a plan on how to collect that information. Then you also need to figure out what's the right architecture for your future, right? If you have a good plan and architecture, then you can define your business outcomes better, right? Then, you know, if you reevaluate yourself, maybe you didn't do that bad. Maybe it was supposed to cost you so much. Then you can make a decision, you know, I don't want to do it. I can sit tight where I am. Or you say, hey, looking 10, 15 years from now, I want to actually put in that investment, right? These are your choices, but you cannot make a hurried decision, if I can use that word, into saying, hey, let me make this change. And then when it doesn't come out with successful result, you cannot really, you know, second guess yourself. Because in my mind, what's important is right plan, right architecture, you know, right outcome definition.
Yeah. No, those are some great points. I liked all the points, but what resonates with me is the comment you made at the beginning about legacy knowledge. Okay, and you can't underestimate, adding to what you said, all of what's been built in the systems that you're pivoting off of, right? But I'll take it then to your last comment, and again, pushing a little bit. I do think many companies, including telcos that I'm aware of, adopting ERP do believe that they can pivot quickly. Quite frankly, I think that's what makes some of the statistics interesting. 75% miss their dates, because I think what you're saying, and I agree, is those dates were probably never realistic to begin with. So I think, you know, a credible timeline and some credible expectations are key. Which takes me, Tom, to an interesting related point, and one of my favorites, and that is out of the box, right? I will tell you, there's some big names in the CRP space. I mean, they're powerhouses, right? And the way they sell it isn't that, hey, it's going to take some time. I've been in some of those meetings, okay? It's like, hey, they're actually sold opposite, right? They're configurable. Yeah, you take it in phases and you can pivot. But the point I'm bringing up on out of the box is an experience I've had over and over again with solutions like CRM solutions that we discussed earlier, where most companies are not willing to change their processes to fit these solutions. I have met some forward-thinking executives, I will say that actually gave direction that we will change our business to fit these solutions. You don't hear that too much. Although I will tell you, even when that directive, if you will, was given, I still saw that there was too much customization. Oh, that dirty word, you guys, customization, right? But it's the truth. So Tom, you know, maybe coming to you with some thoughts on these ERP solutions overall, and maybe some advice to telcos out there that are looking at exploring adopting ERP. What are some of the things they should think about, Tom?
So let's tag on to the out of the box first. I think one of the things that we struggle with as an industry is there's just one box. Well, maybe we should think about this differently, right? Maybe there are 4 or 5 different boxes to choose from, and we don't often look at what box is best for me, right? And that, like what both of you talked about, what I talked about, it's putting the processes that we run today over and against what the software is going to do out of the box. And those are really important because sometimes the process really needs to change, right? And so if you said, a guy, you came to me and said, hey, I got a telco guy here, he's got a problem, what would you advise? I'd say, well, let's go look at what your processes are, and let's see, you know, what solutions you have. And I would say if you have a lot of legacy things that you've built that's very specialized to your processes, and it's hard to support now because some of those people who did it are retiring off, it might be important to look at that and say, hey, it's time to change the process, right? And there may be other places where your processes line up really well with an out-of-the-box solution, and those would be good to move forward. And I think relative to the statistics that you mentioned of where people have lost money and have taken too long, is that they have not taken a measured approach. So I think there's definitely a way to think about an out-of-the-box solution. Here's all the stuff that's in the box, but you know what? I'm not going to take everything that's in the box first off. I'm going to take a piece of it, and I'm going to focus on the part of my corporate business that needs the most help first. I'm going to take that out of the box, and I'm going to go use that. I may leave some things in the box because I'll bring them in maybe in another phase. And I think that's one of the problems that companies fall into, is they take everything out of the box too fast, and then they can't just absorb that because it's a coming together of new software systems and new processes, and sometimes the marriage of those is hard. So measured, thinking about what's in the box, thinking about what my processes are, would be a much better way of thinking how to go forward. That make sense?
It does. It does. Good points. Hey, let's do this, guys. And I know we're bouncing between topics, but I also want to get some thoughts on another cool technology space that's referred to as autonomic systems, right? Or some people talk about it in terms of adaptive technologies. So the analogy that I like to explain this to those who may not be as familiar, think about it like the nervous system in our body, right? The nervous system helps us function without us having to tell it necessarily what to do next, right? It learns, it regulates our body without conscious input. So I like that. I'm thinking about this technology space. Again, here we go. It's actually been around since around the early 2000s, but practical application use has probably been slow, some would say, to adapt. But when I think about adaptive technologies, autonomic systems, Si, I'll start with you. I actually think of telecom, and I think it's a perfect use case for some of these solutions. So interested in your thought on that and if you've seen any of it.
Actually, this is a topic. I think every week I spend probably, a few hours on this because
Oh, good.
we do some work here. I personally do some work here. Two areas which I've seen a lot of work being done is in operations, AI ops, to be more specific, where you get this feedback from all the systems and you identify issues and figure out what are the corrective actions. You mentioned nervous system, similar to that, and you regulate it, or you even give hints on fixing it if something needs manual intervention and so on. Close to automation on the network side, it's been there for a long time, like you said. I mean, it takes time to implement it because the amount of knowledge you need, to correct itself. Human body is a good example to learn, but it's very difficult to imitate it, right? The amount of knowledge every cell has is different. So I think the challenge here is to infuse your systems with all this knowledge, right? The knowledge in the field on what people do when they fix certain things, right? And some of that may be mundane. You can put it all back into the system, then it can correct itself for a big percentage of the problems, right? I mean, continuing your analogy of human body, if you see there are some problems, the wound heals itself. You don't have to do anything. Sometimes you just go over the counter, and get something, but sometimes you have to really visit a doctor, right? It's
right.
So I think similar things exist in software systems and network systems, and you got to identify, what are in the first category, like which of these, if you put some intelligence, you can leave it to heal itself, and how long can you tolerate that condition, right? If you have a scratch, you can tolerate it for a few days, it will go away, right? Similarly, how long you can tolerate that condition, and what is a way to mitigate that condition. So this knowledge has to be built in, and this is where I think we are seeing progress, but it's evolution at that point. The systems have to evolve, and how long it will take to evolve, is something we have to wait and see. But probably, by the end of this decade, you should see big progress.
Good points. Tom, I'm going to come to you. I like how IBM categorized this space. They use an acronym CHOP, C-H-O-P, really focused on self-configuration. I saw you talked about one of these two, self-healing, right? Self-optimization and self-protection. Probably the one that I haven't heard as much about as some of the others. But when I think about those four categories, I kind of like it because I like things that I can actually place in a neat space. But Tom, if you think about it, and accepting those four categories, and again, coming closer to telecom, is there one of those that you think is ripe, or at least can provide the greatest benefit over the other three?
So since we don't have a few hours to talk about this, we'll pick one. Like we've talked about, we're going to see growth in every one of these areas, but let me talk about one that I'm familiar with, is the self-configuration area. And I'm going to do a real specific example. Let's do hey, how do we solve the last 1,000-foot problem? And one of the ways to do that is to do wireless, right? So I think we're going to see a mix of telcos doing fiber and wireless for the very last little bit. And so I got wireless antennas out there, and it's relatively easy today to make antennas that have some self-configuration capabilities to them. And that's really powerful in this space because in the, so in contrast to what Cy was talking about in the network world, I'm in the physical world, right? And we go to the physical world, we put out this wireless system in the wintertime and there are no leaves on the trees, right? And then all of a sudden spring comes and hey, the system's not working, because the antennas weren't designed correctly. We need to configure them. And those are things that we could self-configure relatively well. We could potentially move antenna patterns around from day to night as people move from a work area to a home area. There are a lot of ways that you can think about self-configuration at the physical layer that can really potentially improve operation of a system. That would be really quite good. So I think we're going to see a lot of healing, optimization, protection, but I think we're going to see a lot of self-configuration.
Yeah, yeah. Hard to disagree with that. I agree with the point that we're going to see it across all. I think the other fast follower is the self-healing. I still think there's a lot of room there, especially in the network space. I like this. When Gartner published its 2022 technology trends, they actually put Autonomic Systems on the list, but they stated that companies that sell such solutions on the sales side will require customers to waive indemnity provisions from their systems learned behaviors. I thought, pass that one by your lawyers and see how that discussion goes. That'll be an interesting dialogue. But nevertheless, hey, I want to
what it means is the self-healing system actually may heal this situation. Right?
It maybe we can solve this.
It's a tough problem, you know. That's why they made that comment. That it's a tough problem to solve. You know, it probably borderlines NP complete. You know, if you if you are into those,
I want to move to our last category of next gen technologies and specifically address blockchain a little bit. And again, you know, I think maybe the easiest way, at least the way I think of blockchain, is a digital record keeping system. And when I say system, I don't mean one system, but going across entities. And I think a ledger, a lot of people refer to it as a ledger, almost thinking about the accounting days, is a good way to think about it. But what's powerful about blockchain is that it's decentralized, right? No one entity owns it. And similarly, it's distributed where it allows many different entities to jump on. And supply chain management, I think, has been a sweet spot for it. And also cryptocurrency, do we say it? Nowadays, anything with cryptocurrency, given what's going on in the market, makes people cringe. But nevertheless, those are two examples of industries where there's been adoption of blockchain, which takes me to really applicability in telecom and Cy. You know, we'll start with you again. You know, are there some opportunities in telecom from what you see?
I think, you know, the two main applications you always hear about, right? When you hear about blockchain, one is the whole traceability of things, for lack of a better word. That's the whole meaning of this ledger, that you can you know exactly what happened at what time, right? I can trace it, right? That's one part of it. The other is the smart contracts, but it's an extension of the basic principle. All the other technological things you mentioned, like distributed, encrypted, a lot of different capabilities come with the system. But if you consider that as a black box, right? The two main things is, you know, how do you track things that are happening, maybe in your supply chain and whatnot. You can go back to who originated this transaction, for example. That's the interesting part about it. And the whole smart contract stuff, right? If you look at these two things, see, going back to what we discussed earlier, the innovation versus transformation, right? The blockchain is not something you can overlay on what you have. It has to creep into what you have, right? You have a process that is currently there. And then into that process, you have to blend in blockchain. It doesn't happen as fast as one wants it. Yeah, no, theoretically, you can do a lot of POCs and say these are the advantages of going here, but you have to, you know, you are in the critical path of the company's daily revenues, you know, when you're doing these changes, and people are typically a little bit guarded in doing that. I think, but I do believe this whole digital transformation initiatives going on, not only in telcos, but in all the other industries, I think they will start to blend in blockchain capabilities into it. And again, all the topics we discussed today are something, people will do in the next, several years, right? It's not something which is past tense, but it will be, present and future tense thing.
Yeah. In fact, speaking of what people will do in the future and this concept of continuous evolution, Tom, I think about standards and specifically alignment on protocols. And when I think about blockchain, I think we're still in early stages, even though, as Sai gave some examples, there's been adoption. How should we think about these standards, and do you see it as a concern, an issue for telecoms looking for opportunities?
Yeah, so I think the way to think about it, I like how Sai set this up, is that we need to think about blockchain coming into telecom as a 10 or 20 year evolution. This is not going to be quick. And that's how telecoms like to think about standards and protocols, right? If you think about when we did, let's say in the wireless side, 3G and 4G and 5G, I mean, they have 20-year lives, these standards and protocols and systems. When TM Forum works on something, it's expected to last a long time. And we're really in the early days of blockchain, of how it can work as a ledger in a business. And I think we'll see it kind of inching its way in the telecom space, but I think it's going to be slow and measured, because we're going to, in the telecom space, we're going to want to try to do it right. And we're going to try to take our time, and we're going to put standards and protocols around it that make sense for us as an industry. So I think we'll see it moving in there, but I think we'll see it at a not as quick of a pace as we might see it in some other industries.
There's that comment about it's probably going to go slower than most would hope. Yep. You're going to have some people listening to this who are going to cheer that somebody is saying it, and others who are going to be disappointed, as you would expect. Very good points. I want to take us to our final question. Time goes by fast when you're having fun. And this question goes to both of you, and it has to do with privacy and piracy, right? So when you think about these emerging technologies or next-gen technologies, whether it's blockchain or some of the others that we've discussed, how big of a concern or how big of a focus should we make privacy and piracy? Okay, just to stay with our flow, Sai, we'll start with you.
I mean, these two aspects have to be built into your systems and architecture. Privacy is to protect your customers to a large extent, right? And piracy is to protect yourself, because so that you don't lose your advantage in the industry, at a very broad level. These two are always there. You cannot avoid them, because you have to protect your customer as well as yourself. And how you blend in as you're doing all these transformations, I think that is one of the reasons why things are slow, going back to Tom's point, right? That anytime you make a big architectural change, you have to get all these approvals, both from your legal and your product, for example, and you have to prove to them not only these two, but other things like encryption and data storage and hackability. A lot of these different things, you have to prove that your new architecture sustains the original posture, right? Otherwise, they don't let you disturb what is currently there. So, going back to your question, yeah, you need to make sure you're focusing on these two things to the best.
Yep.
Yep, I agree. Privacy is a big issue. It's analogous to trust, right? Trust is really hard to gain and build and easy to lose, right? And that's the tricky part of the privacy attack, is that defense is hard and expensive. And that's why often companies don't do as good a job on it as they should, because it's hard and expensive. And unfortunately, on the other side of the coin, the attack is relatively easy and easy to spread and is relatively inexpensive to do an attack. And I like to think of the example of a walled city, right? It's really hard to build a walled city that gives you perfect protection. And then often the attack comes through, a metal gate where the water flows in, like we sometimes see in history. And that's a, good analogy for big complex systems like in the telecom space. But it's an area that we always have to be diligent on, is really protection of privacy, because that's why people buy from us, right? Because we're trusted entities, and that's something really worth focusing on.
Great points. Hey guys, it takes us to the end. I want to first thank both of you, Tom, Sai. Great insights, very thought-provoking discussion. So thank you again for doing this with us. I think I'd wrap with this thought. Telecoms, like any company in any industry, have to deal with the fact that they have constrained resources, constrained capital, right? And surely they're going to be thinking about return on investment, okay? As such, I think it's warranted to ask these tough questions and look at some of the lessons from the industry and what some of the experts are saying. Not to be a reason not to move, but to be a reason to move carefully, right? So with that, again, very important conversation. We hope it's been helpful for those of you who are watching, and thank you again to our panel. Have a good day.
Thank you, Guy. Always fun to be with you on these conversations.
Thank you, Guy.
You bet.